We are evaluating research methods in order to get you those higher marks. According to the specification, students should be able to analyse and evaluate sociological theories in order to present arguments, make judgments and draw conclusions. But in particular, we're going to focus on the evaluation part of the research methods. You may be asked an exam question asking you to evaluate the advantages or disadvantages of a research method, like the one that we got here from 2018 paper 3, and that's where you were asked to evaluate the advantages of structured interviews in sociological research. So let's assume that you'll get something similar on experiments. How would you go about answering this question? So firstly, you want to break down the question, and you need to ensure that you demonstrate a range of weaknesses, as that's what is going to be asked, and state why sociologists would be critical of this method. Give examples of studies that have used this method, and that will apply to the sociological research part of the question. And then finally, focusing on the main trigger word, evaluate. And this means offer strengths or ways to overcome some of these weaknesses. So my biggest tip is when you are trying to evaluate is to evaluate as you go along rather than bolting it on at the end. If you do that and you do separate paragraphs which has got some strengths, that is sometimes called juxtaposition, and you don't get as higher marks with this. So your evaluation or the strengths that you're giving in evaluation should link to the point that you have just made. Let's consider the 4 weaknesses, and we want to think about how we're going to evaluate these specifically as we go along to avoid juxtaposition. And we'll start by looking at the first one. Now, firstly, with lab experiments, the first main weakness is the artificiality of them. They're hard to apply to real life scenarios. Once you are in a lab, people know that they are being research and they will change the behaviour, and that is called the Hawthorne effect. And this was from research from Mayo, and you could even mention social desirability, acting in a way that is favourable to societal expectations, and this as a result will lower the validity of the research. However, a possible strength despite this is that you can control all the variables. You are able to uncover cause and effect, it is standardised or reliable, and like in the case of something like Milgram, you can control all of the variables. Sticking with our lab experiments, there are further weaknesses. In particular, there are some ethical problems. In the case of Milgram's study of obedience, there was a lack of informed consent and deception. Some were not informed of the true aim of the experiment until months later, that it was a study into obedience. And some really did think they were administering real electric shocks to another person. However, sometimes ethical issues are essential. Deception and not informing the participants of the true aim of the study is sometimes essential to avoid the Hawthorne effect. And furthermore, there are strategies or solutions put in place to protect the participants, such as debriefing and offering support after the research is finished, including a right to withdraw. Also, the British Sociological Association has strict guidelines about conducting research and the effect on participants, with research having to be approved by ethics boards. So due to previous weaknesses, sociologists have preferred to use field experiments. However, unlike a lab, a bit of a comparison or analysis there, it would be hard to control all the variables. For example, in Rosenthal and Jacobson's field experiment, they concluded that high teacher expectations correlated with high achievement. A bit of a simple correlation. However, there would be other reasons that may explain why some of these students did spurt ahead within the year. They could be late bloomers, parents may have invested in some tuition, or they may have done family experiences that has boosted their knowledge about what was being studied. So despite this, interpretivists would still favour this naturalistic experiment as they are more valid in comparison to a lab experiment. And Rosenthal and Jacobson's research has been quite successful in the fact that it's been repeated over 250 times, and the research has been very influential in teacher training. Finally, the comparative method, or sometimes called the thought experiment, is a way to study cause and effect without testing on real people. And Durkheim used this in his classic study of Le Suicide. But there was a problem with it. He used old statistics, and these might not be accurate. For example, the way that a death is called a suicide can change depending on the person recording it. So the difference that he found between countries might not be because of the social causes, e.g. low levels of integration, but more of how the deaths were recorded, which then led to those patterns. Yet, there is a strength to this. It does avoid artificiality. It's really useful to study past events. There is no ethical issues, there's no harm to the participants, and the method can really just identify clear patterns of behaviour, showing clear comparisons with cause and effect. Positivists, they favour experiments. They argue that they are reliable with a standardised procedure. However, due to lab experiments being small scale, they do not become representative. As a result, they favour the more comparative method instead, such as Durkheim with his classic study of Le Suicide, and he used that to prove that sociology should and can be a science. Interpretivists, on the other hand, reject lab experiments. They argue they are artificial and this will affect the validity. As a result, they prefer the naturalistic field experiments instead. So massive thank you for watching. If you have found it useful, click that like, share and subscribe.